The moderator for this next panel is our very own Paige Peterson, a member of our board of directors. I'm going to give you a little background on Paige while they're doing that, and then we will launch right into it. Paige has had an incredible career. Truly a Renaissance woman, has had many projects that everything she seems to do seems to turn into a success over a wide variety of areas. We at the council, we know her as an accomplished and well-known author, artist, photojournalist. She has written extensively about the Middle East in numerous articles, which we've shared, and maybe a lot of you have been able to see and read. Her most recent publication is The Secret Garden with her co-author Jess Kornbluth. She has served for many years on the board of the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations, and in that role she has graciously hosted a high-level gathering during the UN General Assembly Week in New York, which the last one this year was a wonderful success. Again, it was kind of like this in our gala dinner last night. We invited a few people to attend. They all said yes, and then everyone else saying yes, and there was this, even though she has this wonderful apartment overlooking Central Park West, to say that over 90 people could fit in there, I think that if you'd seen the place, you would bet a month's salary that ain't gonna happen. But it worked, and it was a wonderful affair, and we will continue to do that during UN Week. So we are so grateful for her hospitality and putting up with us. And Paige, if you'd come join, please, and then I think are your folks getting...
My people are here.
Yeah, are they getting mic'd up? We're good? Well, come join us. I'll let you introduce your folks and ask them to the stage.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Paige Peterson. Dr. Levy is on his way up. Jay, you can come up this way. And Laurie Garrett, here she comes. Two extraordinary human beings that are going to tell us about what's happening on the globe and our health.
That are out over here. Oh, you've already got yours. Bring that from home.
Laurie, sit there. Thank you. Okay, so I have the great pleasure of introducing my dear friend, Dr. Jay Levy. So this is an amazing statement to be able to make. Dr. Jay Levy discovered the AIDS virus and named it HIV. I have the extraordinary good grace to have been in a park with him 20 years ago, and he said to me, I see something, turn around. And with that, I felt these fingers on my throat, and 10 days later, I was in surgery for stage 4 thyroid cancer. So he saved my life. Jay is going to be speaking with Dr. Laurie Garrett, and it's an honor. Jay?
Well, it's nice to be here at the Council on Arab Relations. Paige is very difficult to say no to, in case anyone wonders. And this happened because she was telling me all excited about this conference she's having. And I said, you're covering all the topics, but you're not covering medicine or science. So what do you think she did? She just said, you cover it. Now, my experience is that she's such a dear friend that I couldn't really say, you all right?
Couldn't possibly say no.
There you are. There you are. Okay. So I did, and she has educated my wife Sharon's here and myself on Arab relations, and she's a really strong proponent for the relationships between Arab countries and the United States. So, of course, I said yes, and I'm happy to be here. And when I told her I thought we should be covering global medicine, global health and global medicine, I said to myself, who can I get to do that? Well, she's right here. She is the leader in this topic for the United States and probably for the world. She knows all the answers. She's been on all the TV programs. She's the only one that's married, had 3 Ps in journalism: the Polk, the Peabody, and the Pulitzer. So fortunately, I still have good relations with Laurie, and she said, okay, Jay, if you want me to, I will. And so I hope she'll look back on this as a new experience, because it certainly has been for me. Now, tell me, I'll just say some little things about Laurie, then I want to read something that she wrote me. But essentially, she is she's been a science correspondent for the National Public Radio. She was a former part of the Council on Foreign Relations. Her most recent awards were for her global health work, published in the 2014 NYU School of Medicine as an outstanding contributions to global health, and given the award from the American Women for International Understanding. In 2017, she was named one of 10 remarkable women of UC by the Board of Regents of the University of California. In 2024, that's when she was given the Polk Award. She's had several of those. I assembled some questions to ask Laurie in a conversation, and it's quite timely. When Paige said you'll do it on the 13th of November, if you count it out, we realized, or it was right after the elections, so we thought, well, this will be interesting, and let's see what we can hear in terms of the international relations to this. So, again, Laurie accepted this before the election, and after the election, she wrote me the following, which I think is very timely. Dear Jay, everything has changed. I don't know if Trump's candidacy to run NIH, candidates to run NIH, CDC, HHS, FDA, Global Health, USAID will get approved by Congress, but I suspect that Mike Johnson will give him anything he wants. So we think we have to be honest with the audience, that's you, and tell them that the days of American leadership in pandemic and surveillance, response, countermeasures, and so on is now completely over. I don't know if I'd go that far, but she's the better expert than I am. But as I said to Roland, your publicity person here, you're going to hear it first here. So just remember that. And they said they've got the press already alerted. They should. We don't know how to face this new situation. So my hope is that Laurie can give you some insight, and I will have a conversation with her, but first I'd like her to follow up. Oh, okay. Follow up with her overview, and then I'll ask her some questions. Laurie, thank you.
Mahaba. The United States is responsible, if you combine Bill Gates as the #1 philanthropic donor in the global health space with the United States government's contributions, we are the #1 donor for the planet by such a margin that no country or even group of countries comes close. If that money goes away, WHO would be in very serious trouble, as would all the other agencies around the world that we consider to be the pinnacles of and the drivers of global health programs. Let me just tell you what I mean when I say global health. Global health before there was HIV was really defined by WHO, and it was really about building health systems, trying to set out technical advice to countries saying, this is the best antibiotic for this infection, or this is the best way to run an OBGYN program, or what have you. But once HIV appeared in 1981, and then spread all over the world with especially bad impact in sub-Saharan Africa, the entire concept of global health changed with it. And we now see a far more sophisticated but also multi-layered global health response that covers everything from child nutrition programs and basic food programs all the way to very specific targeted disease surveillance, epidemic response, collaboration for vaccine production and distribution, and so on. And the dependency on the United States is absolutely enormous. We are not only the main drivers in terms of cash, and when I say that, I mean, for HIV alone, we've given $120 billion through the PEPFAR program, which is estimated to have saved 25 million lives, and 5.5 children were born without infection because their mothers were treated during pregnancy. So that's 30.5 million lives saved, $120 billion. The entire PEPFAR program is up for reauthorization in a few months, and Republicans in the House have already indicated that for the first time, this bilateral supported, spectacularly successful program that was created by George Bush in 2003 is likely to be destroyed. I don't know who is going to keep medicating and saving lives around the world if the United States walks away. PEPFAR is the numero uno by far. Similarly, there are programs that we support, and they're not just UN programs like WHO, but like the Global Fund to stop AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. We're the biggest donor for malaria control, for tuberculosis control, for all sorts of child development programs. All of this is likely to be destroyed. There are some 40 million people, just for HIV alone, there are 40 million people estimated to be living with HIV in their bodies right now. If they go off medication, Jay can tell you what happens. They will die. And that will be a gruesome, horrible death. And they will be contagious and spreading it to other people. And we will see the whole resurgence of the global pandemic. There is a classic phrase, physician, do no harm. What is worse harm than to revoke treatment for a terminal illness? There's a whole set of apparatus inside the US government that's related to global health. Our Centers for Disease Control, which doesn't just prevent and monitor disease in the United States, but all over the world, and helps and aids in emergency responses when there's outbreaks and humanitarian crises. That is coming under fire. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is likely to be the top health advisor of some form. We're not sure what post he'll get given by the Trump administration, but he'll play a top dog role. And he has already said he wants the FDA completely rebuilt with almost all employees fired. He wants the Centers for Disease Control completely rebuilt with most current employees fired. He wants the NIH completely rebuilt and in fact destroyed so that the money is given out as block grants to the states. And then every single state of 50 states will create its own scientific research institutions and its own scientific expertise, and will destroy the whole concept of national cancer research, of national biological research. And we could go on and on down the line of all these programs, but the bottom line is that we have elected an administration that has a coalition. And the coalition, we refer to it as the MAGA movement. That's what they call themselves, Make America Great Again. That coalition on the health side is quite grim. It's full of people who are likely to be appointed to government positions who do not accept basic premises of biology, basic premises of human health, are big advocates of things like vitamins and mineral supplements, are opponents of the mainstays of modern medicine, such as vaccines, key forms of cancer treatment, and would take this leadership that the United States has played for the entire planet in scientific research. We're the top dog, we're the number one. Everybody in the world turns to the United States of America in a crisis, hoping that we, our public-private partnership between our NIH, our National Science Foundation, and the pharmaceutical industries and the other associated industries, that we will come up with a solution. We came up with 2 very effective mRNA vaccines to deal with COVID, and it was like that. That goes away.
Well, if you
You don't have to press anything, just put it in front of you.
just fine. What about let's make it focus then on the nations of the Arabian Arab countries. What would you see their effect of this new administration? Now, remembering we were told we could talk openly, naming countries. If you quote us, I guess we'll have to say that was out of context. But essentially, I'm curious to know, there's a lot of money in the Arab countries, and I wonder whether if we are no longer providing them with some of these resources, will that be taken up by the countries?
Well, you know, to be very frank, right now in the North Africa, Middle East region out into the Near East, the top health issues are all associated with human versus human. In other words, warfare, refugee crises, famine, destruction of homes, and so on. So the region's #1 problem for health of its own people is of its own making, if you will. That has to do with stopping that kind of warfare. Warfare that targets civilians means that it's not just the civilian that directly died under a bullet or a bomb, but all the family members and all the people associated with that victim who suffer because they've lost a wage earner, and all the facilities that are destroyed. Now, one huge change we saw in the last 20 years that has had spectacular ramifications. It actually goes back to the 90s. It started with Vladimir Putin as the deputy under Yeltsin in the former Soviet Union, then the Russian Federation, when he was put in charge of dealing with the so-called Chechnya problem. And his solution in the Chechnya problem was he came up with this idea that basically came out of his years in KGB. Target the key infrastructures that support the government's popularity. So they blew up schools, they blew up hospitals. It was the first time in modern history that hospitals were specifically targeted, and it worked. When you are in a community where there's no hospital, there are no medical facilities available to you, the community starts to fall apart very quickly, and for all the obvious reasons. Well, when things broke apart in Syria, the same strategy was followed. Deliberate bombing of health facilities, deliberate bombing of hospitals, and targeting of health providers. And we now have, for the first time, a situation predominantly in the Middle East region where having a red crescent or a red cross on your truck makes you a target. It doesn't protect you. It doesn't make you immune from bullets and bombs. It makes you a target of bullets and bombs. And for the first time, we really have a situation where hospitals have been targeted very effectively all over the region and by all sides. I'm not blaming any one force or any one side. We've just changed the nature of acceptable warfare in the region. And by specifically targeting hospitals, you're not just, dealing with whatever is at immediate conflict issue, you're permanently changing the health status of the entire relevant community. Women have to give birth without an OBGYN. They have, you start there and you just work your way through life.
Laurie, as you mentioned this, as a student, we were told how during was it the Korean conflict, where because of the smallpox vaccination programs, both sides agreed to stop fighting. They had 24 hours in which there was no warfare, and they all got vaccinated. Is that possible today?
So the most famous example of that was El Salvador in the 1990s during the peak of the civil war in El Salvador. And remarkably, WHO was able to negotiate, and UNICEF, the two international agencies that do the most vaccination programs, were able to negotiate with both sides a ceasefire. And there was a 2-day ceasefire, and they vaccinated every single child in the country. And this became a trend across Latin America, so that even in highly contested regions, in Guatemala, in Nicaragua, wherever even in the FARC in Colombia, you saw cessation of hostilities for the sake of vaccination. And of course, look at now in Gaza, we have polio. It's wild-type polio, not vaccine-derived polio. It is, for the first time, back in the region. It threatens everybody in the entire Middle East if it spreads, if it gets out of control. This is not, viruses are not a threat just to a certain ethnic identity or national identity, right? Viruses don't recognize borders. And polio is particularly tricky because it's spread in wastewater. So if your sewer systems, your water treatment systems are disrupted by warfare, then everybody starts being at greater risk for contagion. I think the only reason we haven't seen a real polio huge outbreak in Gaza is that vaccination was so good before October 7th of 2023.
Also, how are we going to get that information anyway, in terms of what has happened to the polio epidemic?
I think we have a pretty good idea, because polio happens to be a virus that we can pick up the genetic markers for its presence in wastewater. So it's really quite simple to test and see, is polio in the community? And we could even tell what subtype genetically of polio it is, so we know how dangerous the particular strain is. And this is one of the revolutions we're now experiencing that's very positive in the global health picture, is that we can do this for a pretty broad range of viruses and types of contagion. I always tell everybody, infectious diseases don't drop out of outer space, and they aren't spread by demons and strange forces. Humans are our own worst enemies. We aid and abet the microbes. We spread the disease. We make it go from one human to another. We have crazy animal husbandry practices that aid and abet the transference of animal diseases to humans. We have strange agricultural practices that aid and abet the spread of plant diseases to human beings. It's our fault as a species if we find ourselves victimized by any particular outbreak, any particular spread of disease. And so when you ask, why is polio a danger to the Middle East right now, then you have to look at the political situation. The answers are in the politics, in human relations, and in human behavior.
I'll even go down more basic. I was going to make a little comment on it. Don McNeil has written a commentary where she describes the planet being populated by parasites. We have microparasites and macroparasites. And the only thing that keeps it in control is the conflict between the two. So if we make a vaccine, we can control a microparasite. But if we don't have a vaccine, that's going to be carried to the extreme. And we have to depend on the ingenuity of humans to control a microbe. So this messenger RNA vaccine that was developed, it wasn't developed yesterday. It wasn't developed it was developed in 2001 during the SARS epidemic. They knew they had to come up with something that was going to work, and that's what was developed and we had it, fortunately, at the time when it was most needed. And it's interesting that it is such a tribute to vaccine, but we need, one of the things that's important to recognize with this type of vaccine is it is not the same as the vaccines we've had before, which were really the protein nature of the virus. This is the message for the proteins that is used in the immunization. And the length of time for control as a result of the immunization is not to the extent that we have with certain other vaccines, where you have years of protection. So we have booster shots given at a regular basis, and that's a new observation. I want to end with some promise in terms of where we go with this. But essentially, if you think of the conflict between the microparasites and the macroparasites, then you know where we stand in terms of controlling infectious diseases. And I made a list here, Laurie. I just wanted to know whether any of these should be highlighted more than just mentioned. Besides HIV, you have malaria, you have COVID-19, you have TB, you have antibiotic resistance. I mentioned that because my brother is an expert in that. The abuse of antibiotics has made it almost impossible to control certain bacterial infections. In fact, they predict by 2050 there'll be 3.9 million people dying from the inability to find acceptable antibiotics. What are we doing with that?
Jay, I would say that your approach, if I may, I would back up a bit. I don't really think the issue right now is, can you name a specific microbe or microbial threat that's on the horizon and constitutes the worst case scenario? I could do that, but I could give you some warnings about what's right here, right now. But much more important is, can you tell us why we're less able to respond to them today than we were 3 years ago or 4 years ago? Why is the situation getting more dangerous instead of less? So let me just, you mentioned malaria, for example. Well, we know that all the conditions that are ripe for the spread of malaria via the life cycle of the mosquito are getting worse because of climate change and flooding events. You could mention leishmaniasis, and there the conditions are worsening for the opposite reason, drought conditions and sandflies. We can go down the list of all sorts of infection, but then we have to ask, well, gee, if these are getting worse because of climate change, where do we stand with that? And of course, we just had the report that came out 3 days ago from the World Meteorological Society saying we now have, in fact, had a year where the average global temperature was at 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. So we now have eclipsed what was the target of the 2015 Paris Accords and are on the road to true climate disaster. If you think you've seen disasters now, just remember, no matter how hot it is this year, it's going to be hotter next year and hotter the year after that. No matter how bad the flooding was this year, there's going to be more water dropping out of the atmosphere and into communities next year and the year after that. No matter how bad the drought is this year, it will be worse next year. So we have so altered the planet that the ask right now, today at the COP29 gathering in Baku at this moment, is $1 trillion a year for climate adaptation. This isn't to stop it. This is to keep people from drowning, keep people from starving, keep people from being victims of climate-related events. The $1 trillion a year is the ask. So we're looking at a situation where the biggest donor on the planet is about to cut the pipeline for cash for global health. And this guy already said he doesn't buy into the whole concept of climate change. And I'm quite certain we won't see the Trump administration willing to pony up some chunk of that $1 trillion a year to deal with climate change adaptation. So step by step, the conditions will worsen. If you put it in the terms of McNeil, macroparasite, microparasite. The macroparasites are making the conditions for the microparasites better every single year.
Well, no question about that. And the fact that in some of the comments here, which I think I'll have you comment on it, is you've got other outbreaks that are happening around the world, and they should have been handled through WHO or through really U.S. programs, and they will not be handled. And I just thought you could highlight them and give an idea. So the ones that I have down here were Mpox in Africa, H5N1 flu in the U.S. cattle industry. So you were sacrificing cattle now because they're reservoir for it. Polio in Gaza, which you mentioned. MERS, which is coronavirus in camels in Saudi Arabia. Marburg virus in East Africa. What have we learned from COVID-19 in terms of controlling these outbreaks?
Okay, the good news, I'll give you good news because I can tell we're all really seriously, kicked in the gut. The good news is that some regions have started to really get their act together and form capacity to surveil and respond to outbreaks on their own without such great dependency on Europe and the United States. And Mpox is an example of this, where the early warning system was activated through the Africa CDC, which is a relatively new institution. I think it's only in its 6th year. And there are now African genomic sequencing institutions set up across the continent where African scientists are doing wastewater surveillance and other forms of disease detection that are highly sophisticated, using PCR, polymerase chain reaction, to detect by genomics the presence of specific strains of risk in the environment and put out the alerts. So some things are getting better. But when you look at H5N1, this is, if you ask me what's the #1 thing that scares me and wakes me up at night, this is the virus. H5N1 first emerged out of bird populations that do the Asian flyway in China. And this was in the mid-1990s. The first outbreak was in 1997 in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong responded by killing every single chicken in Hong Kong in order to buy the world time to get its act together to respond to this virus. When human beings get H5N1 from a bird, typically it was being spread from livestock, chickens and ducks to humans, it is 60% fatal. Now, I want that to sink in for a minute, because COVID, at its peak, at its worst, never exceeded 2% fatality rate. And now it's down less than 1%. So if you thought you saw a lot of horror with COVID, imagine it 60 times worse. This would be, this would dwarf the 1918 grand influenza. Now, what's been happening since 1997, and I see you hovering, so I'll be real quick. What's happened since 1997 is that almost all the spread was on the Asia flyway. Wild birds carry it. It's a bird virus. And every now and then the wild birds would land in an agricultural site. They would pass the virus to local chickens or ducks, and then you would start to see transmission that might risk the local farmers and what have you. Okay, the way the world responded was, United Nations set up a special program where they went around all over the world. Wherever there were outbreaks, they paid farmers to kill all their chickens, or they were supposed to pay them. Sometimes that money didn't get to them. But then they had a real problem, because they hit a place where that didn't work. And where was it? Can anybody guess? Egypt. Why didn't it work in Egypt? Because it isn't big agricultural farming on grand scale where most people get their chickens in Egypt. Lots of people have a couple of chickens on their balcony or right in the backyard. Chickens are small scale, they're a family operation. And finding the H5N1 was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. And so, nevertheless, millions and millions of farmers lost all their money and sacrificed their flocks. And this was meant to buy time for the rich world to come up with solutions, come up with countermeasures, come up with effective vaccine, and be ready. And what did we do? Nothing. And then it started to appear in the Pacific region in sea mammals, seals, porpoises, walruses, sea otters, whales, dolphins, and you would see these animals beached up out of the ocean from Chile all the way up to Alaska, dying by the hundreds. And that should have been, whoa, it's in mammals now. It's not just in birds. It's getting closer to our biology. It's getting closer to our immune systems. Let's rev up that response and get ready. And what did we do? Absolutely nothing. And then it started showing up during COVID in wild animals in Canada. It clearly had come via the Pacific animals across Alaska, the Yukon, and into Canada. And it went into bears, it went into foxes, it went into a whole range of different mammals. And again, we should have said, let's get ready, folks. Let's get that enterprise, pump that cash in, build up those giant stockpiles of vaccines, and what do we do? Absolutely nothing. And now it's in dairy cows in the United States. And dairy cows in a few other places, other countries. And we begin to see dairy workers coming up with the virus, and we're beginning to see it spreading, very potentially spreading in human populations. What we don't know, because the science isn't getting funded, the work isn't getting done, and a lot of the big agricultural dairy operations aren't particularly cooperative with investigators. What we don't know is the virus mutating in the cows? Is it becoming a greater or lesser threat to our biology and the capacity to infect us? Is it giving up any of its virulence as it goes from species to species? And we, for the first time now, see it in pigs, and pigs are classically for influenza referred to as the great mixing vessel, because bird viruses getting into pigs tend to transform into human viruses because of the pig's biology.
So we saw what happened to the mink industry with the coronavirus, and the answer is all those. Yeah. And we've seen that we've seen that with other outbreaks of viral infections in Asia, for example. They just dig a big hole, kill the cattle or kill the animal species, and sacrifice them.
Dr. Levy and Dr. Garrett, thank you so much. We have to continue on with our program, but this was fascinating.
Can we end with just some good news?
Yes, please.
Laurie, would you just summarize what we could look on as a good news?
As I was starting to talk about our genomic sequencing capacity, wastewater surveillance, and so on, the good news is that we're beginning to get a toolkit that's much more financially reasonable, that's in the ballpark of what any country, even the poorest nations in the world, could use as part of their toolkit effectively. It doesn't require a PhD, to do the surveillance and figure out what's going on in the environment and create early warning. The trick is to then go beyond the warning to, well, let's do something about it.
I would just say that the need creates the industry that will bring us new technology. I just think the wastewater, that whole technique, now seeing how the viruses are in various communities, is novel. It can be done by high school students. So remember that there is some hope that if we look and invest in education, we'll get there. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.